Hello, everyone. In today's class, we're going to cover the topic of anxiety-inducing media. I told you when we started this course that this is not a mental health aspects course because you have a separate mandatory course on that. And that will be the only kind of exception because we will be discussing mental health issues, but we'll try to wrap it in a more broader sociological context and framework so that we understand the bigger picture in terms of disaster psychology. And what do I mean when I say anxiety-inducing media? So the effect of televised drama and exposure to traumatic content over television broadcasts has been studied for decades now, and most prominently in the United States following the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. Have you heard of that one? Okay, the North Americans one have heard about it, but maybe the other ones haven't. So the Oklahoma City bombing was a devastating, let's call it domestic terrorism event, where two people, ex-military, ex-US military people who had a grudge against the government, planted a huge explosive device in a car and put the car right next to a government building in Oklahoma City. The explosion created a huge devastation, a huge destruction of the government building. And it was kind of the first time, I don't want to say really the first time, but sort of for the figurative speaking, the first time where content, videos and pictures of casualties and other gruesome images from the event were live on the TV. And people were exposed to that secondhand, even though they weren't physically at the scene. So let's watch the video. Again, viewers' discretion is advised, but it does provide some understanding of what people were exposed to back then.
A massive car bomb exploded outside of a large federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, shattering that building, killing children, killing federal employees, military men, and civilians.
The chaos in downtown Oklahoma City did indeed resemble Beirut after what police believe to be a 1,200-pound car bomb ripped through the 9-story federal building shortly after 9 o'clock this morning. More than 500 people were already in their offices, and at least 50 children were in a daycare center on the second floor.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice. Bombing and it was evil. The United States will not tolerate it, and I will not allow the people of this country to be intimidated.
Two suspects now have been identified, known only as John Doe. They're both about 5'10" to 5'11", about 180 pounds, both with brown hair, one with a crew cut, the other with a tattoo. Those sketches were released as rescue workers worked their way through the wreckage of the Murrah Federal Building, looking for survivors among the close to 200 people believed to be still in that rubble.
Authorities now believe the truck that bore the bomb was parked in a space alongside the federal building. A second vehicle may have been nearby to permit the bombers to escape. The FBI said today it was a huge explosion and that the explosive used was most likely a simple combination of fertilizer and fuel oil.
The indictment charges that Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, former Army buddies with a grudge against the government, planned the bombing, selected the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City as their target, bought and stole materials for the bomb, and built it.
Okay, so help me itemize this. What was it in the televised content that could be traumatic? Let's describe this. So what did you see?
People with blood.
People with blood on their faces. The kids, right? The kids with the blood stains. What else? The smoke, the car, the building exploding, all right, which is domestic. It's not somewhere in Beirut, right? It's right next door. What else?
The building, how it was before and then after.
Before and after to see the effect, right? What else? Yep. What else? Mm-hmm. Them being exposed to, or their facial expression, or what they were going through, right? What else?
An area that would be like other metropolitan.
Right, you can associate very easily, right, with the scenario and the scene.
How it was done and the simplicity of it.
Yes, wasn't it troubling? A simple fertilizer and fuel oil, right? So anyone can do it, right? It's almost like anyone can do it. And lastly, what else? Who perpetrated the event eventually? People from within.
Your neighbor.
People from the military, right? The organization that is supposed to protect you, right? So there you have it. So all of these things combined together, obviously, were not aired at the same time. But when now in hindsight, when we are contemplating this, all of these elements, all of these aspects are definitely contributing for the perception of the content being televised as traumatic, right? And so that was the first incidence where people started asking themselves, are we actually televising or broadcasting content that can cause secondary exposure and therefore cause trauma or even psychopathologies associated with stress and trauma? And obviously, the peak of awareness to this and the peak of research around this was after September 11th. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember where you were on September 11th, 2001. I vividly do. I vividly remember. This is what we call in the scientific term flash bulb memory, right? It's when you have a very clear, or you perceive it, a very clear memory of where you were, what you did, because it really etched in your brain, right? So that was one of these moments. And I want us to watch a video because obviously, I mean, the images of airplanes, live video of airplanes going into buildings and the atrocities that happen, that they are enough on their own to be considered stressors or traumatic content. But I want us to watch a video. Again, viewers' discretion is advised because some of the content is graphic. And I want us to discuss what is it about the September 11th televised content that was really changed in comparison to the past.
I took an express subway train from Times Square to Chambers Street, which is the stop just before the World Trade Center. The first thing I saw was the two World Trade Centers. Both of them had smoke and fire coming from them. I just started making my pictures. I was photographing the burning building when EMT says, "Oh my gosh, look at that." And we started seeing people coming down out of the building. I instinctively picked up my camera and started photographing them, following them as they came down, until I photographed what has become known as the falling man. It's a very quiet photograph. It's not like a lot of other violent photographs from other disasters. There's no blood, there's no guts, there's nobody getting shot. But people react to it in a way that they feel that they can relate to this photograph, that they might have been in the same situation and they might have had to make whatever choice the man in the photograph made.
What is it? What is it about the 9/11 content being televised that is dramatically different?
Don't show any like injury. It is treated with the blood, the children.
So technically, it's not supposed to be traumatic. Why? In what way?
Like it's because it's not so extreme in that way, it can make
it doesn't force that like where you're talking about the la 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 la
Mhm.
because there isn't that like, oh, it could never happen to me because of all the blood. I've never been in that situation, but there's no blood. It's like very relatable.
Very relatable, very intrusive, right? So, and the photographer was very well articulated there. He said people were relating to this because they could place themselves in the shoes of that person, thinking about a situation where they had to make the same choice. Do I want to die from suffocation or burning to death, or do I want to jump and end it all? Right? And under these circumstances, people, even though they were thousands of miles away, they almost felt as if they were physically present in the situation. And so September 11th was a peak of awareness to whether or not content over the media, over the television can actually cause trauma. But I guess it wouldn't be a surprise to you if I said that according to the American Psychological Association, the decision is and currently is that media exposure does not meet the criterion for stressor. So you cannot associate or you cannot claim that any psychopathologies you have are as a result of viewing something over television exposure. And the literature has mixed results with that regard. Some studies are very clear and are very suggesting that there is a linkage between media exposure and PTSD or other psychopathologies. Others say statistical significance is not always clear cut. But at least according to the American Psychological Association, there isn't enough evidence to create the criterion or to put media exposure as something that meets the criterion for psychopathologies. Yes.
Maybe not just media, but also like the movie or film industry. They often show, especially with disaster movies or whatnot, they show images that can be very disturbing. And people do have nightmares or, actually react to it. Do they consider that?
Are you talking about fictional movies or are you talking about documentaries?
Both. I mean, I would say both can have the same effect.
So we will eventually get to this discussion, but what I want to say right now is an automatic response to what you're saying is that sitting down and watching a documentary, yet alone a fictional movie in the movie theater, right, is your own choice, right? Now we'll get to the same discussion where do you have a choice when you watch the news reports? Is it really a choice? That's mainly what the sociological aspect of it in our discussion would be, right? But at least there I can understand the decision. So if you don't want to feel bad about it, don't go and watch a movie. It's totally your choice, right? Do you have the same choice when you're watching the media reports of a certain event? We'll get to this. Yeah.
Don't you think that this is not factor that demonstrate that there is some kind of psychological effect in the crowd, like people tell?
Not only do I think that, I would actually, over the course of this presentation, create the arguments in favor of that. Definitely. That's the point. That's a sociological phenomenon I want to get to. There was another question? Okay. I do have to mention here that even though I, as a researcher, tend to disagree with this decision because I think there's more evidence than none with regards to the association between exposure to media, traumatic content over the media, and development of psychopathologies, I can understand why this decision was made, because if it was the other way around, you would have to pay disability to almost anyone, everyone. Okay? Because everyone can claim that their psychological conditions are as a result of watching something over the TV, over the media. So not always are the decisions with regards to, let's call them technical, professional things, are necessarily because there is or isn't evidence, right? It could be also because, interests. Yeah. Yes, I don't know if they already moved to. It's the Bible. It's the psychological Bible. So yeah, psychologists and psychiatrists around the world. I don't know if it's already DSM-6. Actually, I'm not aware if because this one is 2013. So I'm guessing a newer version. Yeah, I think maybe. But I wouldn't be surprised if DSM-6 keeps this as the same situation, doesn't change it for the reason I mentioned before. So in order for us to spark a little bit the discussion, I want to show you this video I found online. It's from a YouTube channel called The Young Turks. I actually have no idea what the name means or what they are actually. But they're having a discussion which I think can be very helpful for what we want to discuss here today. So take a listen.
Researchers at UC Irvine wanted to see whether or not people can suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder simply by watching television with traumatic scenes. Now, this is a really fascinating and controversial finding. A lot of researchers disagree on whether or not you can develop PTSD as a result of watching something traumatic over the airwaves. But what they realized through this particular study is, yes, there is a correlation between watching these types of images on TV and getting PTSD. Now, let me read you a little bit from the study. It says that the study finds that those who spent more than 6 hours a day watching media coverage of the April 15th Boston Marathon bombing and its aftermath suffered more powerful stress reactions than did people who were directly involved but watched less news coverage of the event. Now, there's a very important caveat to mention here. The majority of the respondents that did experience symptoms of PTSD were already predisposed to PTSD. So, of course, that plays a huge role. But the fact that they watched 6 hours of traumatic footage through the airwaves did play a role in them developing those symptoms as well.
You say it somewhat authoritatively, but nonetheless, drop it. I'm starting out with not buying it.
Okay.
Okay. Look, I have a feeling, and then that feeling was honestly confirmed a little bit by what the rest of the study indicates, that people who want to get PTSD through the TV. Okay. Now that's a controversial comment, right? But what I mean is, like, these people are watching like 6 hours of coverage on a daily basis of the bombings, and then they get all hurt over it and stuff like that. Look, is there a reason to be upset? Of course there is, right? It's a bombing, especially if you're personally involved, you get PTSD from that. Of course, I get that. I'm not minimizing that at all. But somebody's sitting there watching it for 6 hours so they can have these feelings of trauma, etc. They kind of want the trauma. They want drama in their lives.
So I'm sure that people like that exist, people who actually experience that trauma firsthand, and then they will see news coverage of it, and then they'll watch it. And the researchers said that initially that might actually help them cope with the trauma that they experienced firsthand, but later it will contribute to a self-perpetuating circle of distress. So I thought that was also really interesting.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. Self-perpetuating cycle of distress. In other words, you did it to yourself. And in my experience, people do it to themselves largely because psychologically and usually unconsciously, that's what they wanted. Like, I know I live with a guy who just created every drama in the world, would pay all of his bills late just so that he can get into fights with people to try to avoid the late fee.
He sounds like a...
What do you think?
I think that about someone do this inside the development of the post-traumatic stress, that person has something like, you cannot ignore it, like, if I have one drama, I have a problem. Like, like, not like, oh, I want this trauma. I want this, He's already sick, or whatever it is.
Okay.
This reasoning of like this, like anecdotal evidence. So I once lived with a guy who was like that. So
that's his evidence. I mean, don't take it for the scientific worth of it. Okay, that's why I called it "Let's Spark the Debate." But what do you think about the argument? Do people get PTSD because they want to get PTSD? Does that make sense to you? Anyone understands this argument? Go ahead.
I think I could imagine it maybe coming from that we do have experienced. We humans do have a tendency to get attracted to terrible things.
Okay.
And so maybe that's where this idea comes from of saying people want to have PTSD. I don't think they actually want to have PTSD, but they are so interested or so intrigued by what they see that they continue watching it and get, want to understand it, and then they want me to see it again.
Okay, they're drawn to the fire like a moth, right? Yeah. Like a moth to or they're drawn to the newscasts like a moth to a fire or a moth to a light, right?
So they don't actually want what it causes in them.
Yeah.
They are attracted to it.
So what is it they want? Why are they attracted to something?
Over.
You're starting to piece the pieces together. You're starting to see the problem here. So now we're gonna use this information and introduce 2 studies we've performed in this context, and then try to wrap our minds around the sociological phenomena that is happening here. The first study we've done was back in 2014. And just like you said right now, news coverage of terror incidents, especially wars, here in Israel, but largely nowadays everywhere around the world, is a 24/7 kind of news coverage. There's no escaping it. You open the TV and it's there. You switch the channels and it's there. Even if you want to go to, I don't know, a YouTube channel and find something else, or Netflix, they will also offer you some content, documentaries or whatever that is related to actual incidents, right? And here in Israel, it's almost like an art that has been developed to the extent that if something happens, I'm not talking about right now, I'm talking about, let's say, 5-10 years ago, right? There was a surge again in terrorist incidents. It was called the knife intifada. If you remember, there were a lot of stabbing incidents that were happening around the country. And so there would be a terrorist attack someplace, and the news coverage will start of that event, and they will get a single 10 seconds video from the scene and will loop it forever, for 10, 20 minutes until they get something new. The same video looped over and over, the same 10 seconds looped over and over. So at some point, it almost looks like a crazy report. It's like, do you have anything new to say? If you don't, please go back to regular broadcasting and come back when you have new information. Why do we need to keep watching the same 10 seconds video over and over again? And at the same time, you don't want to switch the channels because maybe the new information is arriving now, maybe now, right? Again, control and wanting to be in control of whatever is happening. So back in 2004, we had the protective edge war with Gaza. During that conflict, 64 soldiers lost their lives and 3 civilians on the Israeli side, of course, much more on the Palestinian side. The numbers here look funny when you compare them to numbers nowadays, right? But more than 3,000 rockets were fired. And at some point, 70% of the country's population was under rocket fire, meaning that they had sirens that, as a result of which they had to find shelter. And so in an effort to meet public demand for news information, news about what's going on, the 3 main news channels, back then it was Channel 11, Channel 22, and Channel 13, Channel 10, sorry, switched into a 24/7 broadcasting of news. They almost even skipped commercial breaks, right? Just 24/7 news reports. I even remember a very, I don't even know how to call it, like a grotesque moment, or not grotesque, a Kafkaic moment, a really absurd moment where they said at some point in one of the evenings, okay, guys, we're sorry, we have to move on to Big Brother. You remember this show, Big Brother? Where you have housemates residing in a villa, because they were there, they had no idea what was going on outside, and you have to keep, taking one out every week in order to get to the finals, right? So they said, okay, we're sorry, we're switching to Big Brother broadcasting now, but if anything happens, we'll come back to the news report. I was like, what the hell is happening? Are you apologizing for broadcasting the regular broadcasts? What's going on? I mean, it came to such absurd that it was really crazy. So what we wanted to understand was how does this 24/7 news reports affected the perceptions of people as well as their psychological well-being, right? And so you have the timeline here of the 2014 study where the war starts. At some point, there is 70% coverage of population with rocket fire. Ground invasion starts on July 17. Ground invasion means that military troops are at higher risk, right? Military troops have families back home, higher risk, more interest in whatever is going on. And our survey took place on July 21st. And on August 26th, we finally had the final ceasefire and the war was over, right? Because there were plenty of ceasefires that weren't kept. So that's the general outline of where our study was performed. We did this on an internet-based survey. We used a sample of 500 participants from the adult Jewish population because back then, to some extent also nowadays, polling services are not very good at polling Arab citizens. They don't have a representative sample of the Arab population here in Israel. So we kept the sample to Jewish population only. If you ask me, you can definitely generalize the conclusion also to the Arab population, but I won't make that argument because as a scientist I can. The main tool was a questionnaire we designed for this study that assessed viewing patterns, attitudes toward the newscast, as well as anxiety symptoms. And we asked responders to provide a response in retrospect before the ground invasion and after the ground invasion to see if that had any effect. So let's see some of the results. In terms of viewing patterns, 87% said they are watching the news, so huge, vast majority, right, watching the news, of which close to 77% said they increased their intake of news coverage. Okay, so most, if not all, people watch the news and increased their intake of news consumption over the period of the war. Watching the news increased with age. The older the person, the more they want to watch the news. Non-religious more than religious people, and people with high income more than low income. And the increased frequency was reported more by women compared to men, by academics more than others, and again, by high income more than low income. Just as a side note, for those of you interested in research, not always is a finding have actual meaning, okay? The fact that women increase their frequency more than men doesn't necessarily mean that there's a gender difference. It could be a reporting bias, whereas women are just more frank and sincere in their responses than men, right? So not always is a finding something you want to follow up in terms of policy. Sometimes it's just a reporting bias. In that regard, why would high-income people report watching more the news and more intake of the news, for example? What could be an alternative explanation? It could be that they are more interested than people who have low income, or
they're expected to do it more? For whatever.
Maybe there's a social construct where they're expected to do more, or most simply put, they have more time. Yeah, they don't need to work 7 jobs to earn a living, right? So not always is a finding has meaning. Sometimes findings are just finding. Okay, close brackets. Here's the results with regards to the attitudes toward the broadcasts. And this is where it starts to get interesting. More than 50% of viewers said that the newscasts were addictive, meaning that they need the constant stimuli. They can't look away. They have to get it all the time. It's almost like getting an addiction to something, right? Despite the fact that a third were saying that watching the newscast was burdensome, was sitting heavy on their hearts, right? And 30% saying they had fear of missing out. They were actually experiencing FOMO, right? If you know this word, FOMO, they don't want to risk being not up to date, right? Only 14% said that watching the news was relaxing to them, right? So that's a very small percentage of people watching the news for the sake of getting some relief as a result of watching, right? 11% said they were stressful, and only 10% said they were trying to avoid the newscast, which goes back to your question from before about the phenomena we're seeing nowadays of more and more people actively choosing to close the newscasts and not watching them. When we get to the 2023 results, you'll see it more. Okay, but back then in 2014, only 10% of people said they were actively trying to avoid the newscasts, and more than half said that they found the watching addictive. They cannot do something else. They have to watch it. Yeah, you have a question.
Just want to add to the addictiveness, and there is, I don't know if you guys know it, the Newsroom it's called. It was a US series, and they have an episode where they talk about how news channels make those crisis reporting. Like for example, like in the example, it was a kidnapping of a kid. That happens a lot, but some cases get picked out and just broadcasted like nationwide in the US. And how they get picked out and how they make it so that people do have to keep going, the fear of missing out and make it addictive. And it's and they have a kind of breakdown inside of the episode where they explain how they do it.
Right. So we keep watching and we keep treating or hoping that media is the watchdog of democracy, right? So we assign the media the role of reporting the truth so that us, the public, can always be exposed to what's going on. And if we have criticism, we can hold an accountable hand toward the government, right? In nowadays world, this role is slowly crumbling. And the interest of media is mostly clickbait and watching commercials, right? That's very, very vivid. And that taps into if that's their interest, and if that's what ticks them, and if that, we know there are a business, right? Media are business. So they have to operate in a way that creates revenue. And their way to create revenue is create bombastic titles and take sideline marginal phenomena and blow them out of proportion so that they are discussed because they are interesting to people, because they are extravagant or whatever. So we know that happens. What is interesting with regards to this is that the news channels moved to a 24/7 and skipped the commercial breaks. They skipped the commercial breaks. There was a sociological phenomenon here that goes even well beyond this axioma, this fact you just mentioned, that there was a demand by the public and there was a match with the media meeting that demand to the extent that it was a self-feeding circle all the way to we don't air anything else. And if we do, we apologize for it. So that goes even well beyond the fact that they are prone to doing this kind of things, right? There was a question? Yes. We did. Oh, we didn't do that. Okay. That's a very good question. Since I don't have the exact data, I don't want to say, I don't want to make arguments as if they're factual, but my intuition is that you will see similar response patterns, psychological response patterns in classical media and social networks. For the reason that on social networks, you often see many of the reports you see on classical media, and the only, let's call it added value, or the difference is you are also exposed to other non-mainstream reports. So rumors, fake news, posts by people, celebrities, or content creators or opinion influencers who are also giving their penny, or how's it called, like their thoughts about a certain thing. So that's the only exception. And that can definitely have an accelerated or an influence on the way people react to these reports. You want to add something to that?
There is an interview with I think it's the ex-CEO of Instagram or something. She stated that negative imagery and content and stuff, and negative in the sense that it can be either, like telegraph violence, that is actually favored by the algorithm, so that stuff gets put out more.
Yeah. Which goes back again to,
and it goes both into like the classic Instagram stuff of so body positivity will get a negative algorithm then like body shaming, for example, because people just consume more negative content.
Right. It's a human psychological need. We don't want to ignore this. What you mentioned before was spot on. There is a human psychological need for consumption of this information. But the reasons why we consume it are not in line with the outcome it generates. Let me put it the other way around. We are interested in negative sociological phenomena because we are a group liking species, right? We like to live in groups. So we are very interested in phenomena that is biting against our tendency to live in groups. We want to keep an open eye for people who are dissociating themselves from the group or behaving in an antisocial behavior so that we can defend against those phenomena, right? So that's why it's built into our brains to pay attention to these kind of phenomena. But nowadays, in nowadays world, when we have more means to cope with this tendency to keep wanting to have control over this phenomena creates overexposure and overconsumption of this content, which leads to a different result, not survival, rather psychopathologies or stress, anxiety. It leads to a different outcome, but the need is there for a reason because it had a survival benefit back in the days. Yes.
That has the number of deaths.
Mm-hmm.
All the time the news was like this 14 number.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like terrified. Like I could like talk with my neighbors and say like who's going to be next? Like who's going to be and like it's crazy like 24 hours they are like running the numbers, updating the numbers of death people.
Mm-hmm.
And we're like it's catastrophic.
When we get to thank you for that. When we get to the COVID, the psychology of a pandemic, I will pay much more attention to fear tactics and fear appeal and how detrimental that is to people's well-being first and compliance with health regulations on the other. So you lose on both ends. But definitely, I'm totally against fear tactics. If there is any message I'd like you to leave this course with is that, but we'll get to it. Okay. Was there another question? Okay, so when we dive into the effects of the ground invasion, we saw that the people were responding that the ground invasion made things worse, right? More people were consuming the news reports after the ground invasion, and less people wanted the regular broadcasting to return after the ground invasion. But even then, look at the numbers. 69, almost 70% of opinionated viewers said they wanted the regular broadcasting to be restored, right? Before the after the ground invasion, and 75% before the ground invasion. Either way, the majority of people were saying, I can't take my eyes off of it, turn it back to the way it was before. Do you see the sociological phenomena that is happening here? It's almost like I can't quit smoking, take the cigarette out of my hand. I can't quit drinking, take the bottle out of my hand. It's almost the same thing. It's assigning the responsibility for doing something about it to someone else. It's like the public is saying, it's too big on me. It's too much for us to deal with. We cannot shy away from it, but we would really like you to help us do it. It's almost like a captive audience, right? And then we get to the bottom line, which is the anxiety symptoms. We assessed 4 of those, and we know that those 4 are precursors for PTSD. They are precursors for psychopathologies, including PTSD. So physiological hyperstimulation such as accelerated heartbeat, sweating, irregular breathing, 13% prevalence. A sense of uncontrolled fear or anxiety, 18%. Sleeping difficulties, 22%. And fearful thoughts, more than a third of people reported having those, 37%, right? That was a very alarming prevalence of those anxiety components back then. 17% of people reported one of these, 12% reported 2 of these, 6% reported 3, and close to 8% of respondents reported all 4. And we know from scientific literature that the more of these anxiety symptoms you experience, the more likely you are to develop psychopathologies down the line, right? So those are, back then in 2014, those were alarming numbers with regards to what can ensue after that. But again, I remind you, according to the American Psychological Association, the watching of these newscasts does not meet the criterion for a stressor for any psychopathologies. People reporting negative attitudes toward the newscasts were also reporting more anxiety symptoms. So the more you perceive the newscast to be burdensome and stressful, the more you experience anxiety of it, right? People who increased their frequency of the newscast reported more anxiety symptoms. So the more you watched the newscast, the more you reported anxiety symptoms, just like the Boston Marathon study, right? Women more than men. Again, if you ask me, reporting bias. I don't think it's necessarily a genuine finding, but more of a reporting bias. And younger people more than older, actually. In most studies around the world, it will be the other way around. But here in Israel, younger people reported more anxiety than older people. Can you hypothesize why?
More exposure in general.
Good hypotheses. Okay, I'll take it. What else? Because I had something else in mind, but they're definitely valid. They have more risk because they need to go to the military. Good hypothesis too, valid. I had something else in mind. Yeah, that was my hypothesis. They had more experience with this. They were, oh, we've been to so many wars. This one will go away too. So they have more resilience or coping resources. So they said, these two shall pass, right? So, and lastly, we did a multivariate analysis, and the worst thing that happened to us as a research team, since you're taking the statistics class, you can probably relate. We got almost statistical significance. Almost. If the sample was a bit bigger, we'll probably cross the threshold. But anyways, we see that people who increased their newscasts, people who watch the newscasts were 1.6 times more likely to report at least one anxiety symptoms. And if you see here, the confidence interval includes the number 1. That's why the statistical significance is above 0.05. But generally speaking, people who watch more of the news are more in threat, more at risk of reporting more anxiety symptoms, right? So that was that. Back in 2014. And then October 7th happened. And I remember the first few days after October 7th, I was a zombie. I wasn't able to do anything. I was so much in mortality salience that I was going nuts, right? But I was practically incapable of doing anything. I was so shocked and so devastated by what happened that I was numb. I felt numb. And then a few days after, I was like, what the hell is wrong with you? You know, like slapped myself in the face a few times. And I go, you're a researcher, do research. Do something. Remember, we talked about in the death mechanism, the death avoidance mechanisms we have. One of them is self-esteem, right? So if I do something, if I contribute something, that way I can cheat death. That was my way of helping myself get out of the mortality salience I was experiencing. I said, you already did this study. You have the questionnaire, run it again. Let's recollect the data for the same questionnaire, this time for the October 7th attacks, massacre. So that, again, an internet-based survey that happened a week after October 7th, a week after. It included more than 800 participants, again, from the Jewish population for the sake of having the results comparable. And again, the same tool was used assessing viewing patterns, attitudes, and anxiety symptoms. So let's take a look at the results. Again, an overwhelming majority, 84% of respondents indicated they were watching the news more than usual. remember, in the previous one, it was, did I have it here? No. In the previous one, it was, I think, 76%, 76. It increased to 84. 84% of people said they increased their intake of news consumption. You have a question about that?
Yeah, the channels also switched back to 24/7 broadcasting?
For sure, yeah. Definitely 21. Definitely 24/7. I mean, there was even in the middle of the night there were panels sitting in the channels. Men and women, take a look at this, and that's why I told you reporting bias. Men and women reported similar news consumption. This one crossed the threshold so much that even men were willing to admit they were watching the news. That's why I told you before that I take some of the results with a grain of salt, because it was a reporting bias. Back then in 2014, men were also watching the news. They were just saying, I'm fine. Right? But now, in after October 7th, that was so devastating that they were willing to say, yeah, I'm watching it too. And similarly, no statistically significant differences found in news consumption across all socio-demographic variables. Everyone were consuming the news similarly. Everyone were increasing their intake of news consumption similarly. In matching the level of risk, because October 7th was definitely different from what we experienced back in 2014. You have a question?
Do the case of it all like phone, like I don't have cable.
Okay.
So I don't have cable. On October 7th, I did have cable.
Yeah.
I lived somewhere else. It was going 24/7. But now I don't have cable, so all the news I get are news notifications from my phone, and then I click on the article, and that I know a lot of people in my generation, it's like cable is fading out, cable's not going to exist. Like, that's what's going to happen. So I'm curious, because in 2014 it was very different. Now there's social media, and now there's like your phone is everything. Mm-hmm. So there is a massive difference in how people.
Right. So we weren't asking necessarily about TV consumption. We were asking about news consumption from the TV channels. And you can get those on your phone. I mean, even if you don't watch the actual TV plugged into a socket in the wall, right? You still have the same newscast in your phone. So we were asking about those. Okay. Take a look at the attitudes and perceptions and the way they change. Remember, I told you more than 50% said they were addictive. That increased to almost 57%. Remember, I told you 33% said that they found the newscast burdensome back in 2014. Close to 50% said it this time. Fear of missing out increased from 30% to 45%, or close to 50%. And a decrease in the people reporting that they were feeling this newscasts were relaxing from 14 to 12%. Take a look at the stressful data. Increased almost 3 times, more than 3 times, from 11% saying the newscasts were stressful to 37%, and around the same percentage of people saying they were trying to actively avoid watching the newscast. If I ran the survey today, now I'm intrigued to do it. But if I ran the survey today, my imagine is this number will increase dramatically. Not only will it increase dramatically, I had a discussion. This is really it's not besides the point, but it's an interesting concept not related to what we're talking about. I don't know how many of you know, but here in Israel, we have channels 11, 12, and 13, which are generally considered more critical against the government. And there's channel 14, which is generally considered much more in favor of the government and much more, let's call it patriotic and right-wing leaning, okay? I know of many people, through some of my friends, who choose to move from channels 11, 12, and 13 to channels 14 because they say watching channel 14 makes me feel better. And they call channels 11, 12, and 13, in Hebrew they call them Arutzei HaTavela, the channels of scare. Whereas the channel 14 is the channel of nationalism, patriotism, feeling good about the situation. And I really want you to process the sociological phenomena and the choice people make. And I think if there's a study to be done here, it's not just with regards to how many people choose to avoid the newscasts, but how many choose to consume, I want to call it non-factual news because it's borderline non-factual, right? But they are, let's call it, they're willing to take less criticism and less factual reporting of the situation for the sake of feeling better with themselves. And what does that mean in terms of our democracy and our capacity to cope with criticism against the government? Yes.
When you consume like news, especially for television, people don't want to see the news. They don't want to read the comments. Because it's like, you know,
Yep.
I think like the weight of the comments made the news worse,
Mm-hmm.
and people are trying to avoid this. Like I was trying to avoid it.
I'm too now. Well, now I have an excuse with my twin babies born. I have less time to watch television, so I was technically not watching the news. But I find myself that when I do have time, and I open the TV and it opens automatically on one of those channels that reports news, I say nah, and I go to YouTube and I watch something else. I actively do that. So I think if any one of you is interested in doing a thesis about this, give me a call because I really think there's something there. People are more so nowadays trying to avoid because this is too long of a disaster. And under these circumstances, the psychology changes and people need the resources to recharge their batteries. They no longer want to see the same content that is depressing, and they will compromise their how do I say this without getting into too much politics? They are willing to compromise their democratic values for the sake of well-being. And you know what? It makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. People's well-being is important. And if it means that now I'm watching this news channel that has butterflies and unicorns and everything is great and perfect and no troubles around the world and it makes me feel happy, makes perfect sense from a psychological point of view, makes perfect sense. There's a price to pay in terms of our democracy and our capacity to cope with criticism against the government, but it makes perfect sense from a psychological point of view, okay? And take a look here. So on the bottom part here is the table of the anxiety symptoms from 2014. Take a look at the numbers from 2023. I remind you, this is a week after October 7th. A giant leap in everything. 3 times the numbers of people reporting physiological hyperstimulation. Almost 4 times or 3 times more people reporting sense of uncontrollable fear. Twice the people reporting sleeping difficulties and twice the people reporting fearful thoughts. Out the roof. So we see it's qualitatively different. October 7th was qualitatively different from 2014. 2014. And take a look here again. Around the same numbers of people reporting 1 or 2, but take a look at the number of people reporting 3 and 4 of those symptoms. From 6% to 17%, from 8% to 21%. A fifth of the population is reporting all 4 anxiety symptoms. And I just told you before that the more you report, the higher the chances you'll develop PTSD down the line. We are creating a crazy society. Society is getting more and more crazy by the day through news consumption. Yeah.
The actual members, do they have the same symptoms?
Yeah, many of them report. Yeah. Especially after October 7th, they say it from a different perspective. It's not just about seeing the footage, and they are, by the way, exposed to raw footage that most people don't get to see. So it's even worse there. But they were saying that they felt so bad with the situation because they felt like they were the only people who were there as first responders. When the military wasn't arriving, when the police and the EMS wasn't responding, it was the journalists who were getting text messages from their friends saying, there are terrorists outside, send the military over, and they felt like they weren't able to help. Many of them were afterwards saying, they were interviewed and they were saying, I felt like I was useless. I was reporting things, but I wasn't able to help these people who were crying for help. They said, no one is there. You're the only person who's outside able to communicate with the world that I know. Send the military over. And, they said, I'm texting the people I know in the military, whatever. No one is coming. They felt, so they are exposed to raw footage and felt like they were not helping the people they wanted to help. So they had the double trouble there in terms of psychological distress. Yes.
Could be also that all of these outlets anymore because outlets go to every form of social media, and then they're on your TV, they're on your Instagram, they're on TikTok, they're on everything.
Right. So
it's like everything that you're seeing.
Right. So the question on the questionnaire was, with regards to the newscasts, have you experienced the following symptoms? Does it really isolate the symptoms for only watching the newscast? Not really. But that's a study limitation. So there's no way for me to say that these symptoms are solely because of watching the newscast. Obviously, people know people who lost their lives or became disabled, stories coming from different sources, social media, family members, hallways talks. So very difficult to isolate just the news reporting. But in terms of the scientific method, what we try to do, the way we try to isolate it is by questioning, by asking. Put the sirens aside, put everything you heard aside. With regards to the newscasts themselves, have you experienced these 4 symptoms?
A lot more graphic media than
Ooh, definitely.
Because this time around we had we did everything on a GoPro, so everything was, or it's not a GoPro, many, and it was all recorded, and then that was shown on the news. Even if it's blurred out, it's still there. Versus 2014, I don't remember seeing. I mean, I was 13, but
it was qualitatively different.
Yeah.
No argument there. I'm not comparing the 2 wars.
No, I know, but I'm saying just that the graphic nature was so much greater this time around that had 2014 also had the same sort of footage, like GoPros
Or September 11th.
Or exactly.
Yeah, you're right.
It might have also.
No, your assumption is already what I would say evidence-based. We know that the more gruesome and the more difficult to watch the images are, and the more, let's call it, the bigger the event, the more it has effect on people's well-being and distress. Definitely there, right? So that's why I said it's qualitatively different, right? But the world is stepping toward more of this and less of 2014 kind of wars. So if we understand that these are the kind of disasters we are going to face, right? And it doesn't have to be human-made. Obviously, human-made or human-induced disasters hit much more into our stomachs than if the earth shook. Right? You say, okay, Mother Nature unleashed this devastating blow on us. What can you do, right? But nevertheless, if earthquakes become stronger and more difficult, hurricanes, climate change, weather events become more severe and more frequent, this is the kind of reporting we're going to see day in, day out, right?
Even with Hurricane Helene and the other one that was this year that I'm blanking on the name of. That just happened in Florida and South North Carolina, wherever. I saw even in my social media feeds way more graphic videos, and I lived through those kind of events 3 separate times, and it was so. But even living through it, then the last one I was in was 2017. There was a lot less media about it, just on social media. It was covered a lot less, and people. All of the world, in the comments were oh my God, I feel for you guys. I'm praying for you, worried about individual people that are posting these things. They're leave the city, you have to be safe. Where that response wasn't it didn't look like that at all. in 2017.
And that's why I'm saying we're stepping more toward these type of events and disasters than what we used to have in the past. Yes.
Also, when it comes to all these types of things, there's a massive shift compared to like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, or whatever, of any citizen can be a journalist.
Yeah.
And all the videos that you're seeing of it, it isn't like a proper
professionally edited and reviewed.
Obviously, people are saying all these things and calling themselves whatever, but like it's much more personal because now everyone has a camera in their back pocket, and all the footage is going to be raw. It's all going to be like the man, like,
which is not necessarily bad, right?
Yeah,
but I mean, truth
more personable now. So
it becomes more personal. It becomes more personal, right? Absolutely, you're right. It becomes more personal, becomes less censored, right? Much more raw footage. But all of these things, I would say, I'm okay with, unless for the fourth thing, which is everyone now is an expert on everything, right? So everyone knows about everything, and they already can give you the bottom line of what it is that you are watching, right? There's no review process, there's no due diligence, nothing, everything. This is the raw footage, this is what it is, this is what you should think of it, right? That's the problem. So not necessarily the first three, which is, let's call it journalism at its raw way, sort of. The fourth one, because journalists have a professional etiquette. They're like supposed to have a professional etiquette.
Now compared to 20 years,
you're right.
More political commentators.
You're right. The journalists in their original form are supposed to have a professional etiquette where they review information and then separate facts from fiction and from opinions, right? But that's no longer the case, right? This time, the multivariate analysis was strong enough to create statistical significance. So I'm capable of reporting that there was a statistically significant correlation between all of the attitudes and reporting anxiety symptoms, as well as a statistical significance with regards to news consumption and reporting the anxiety symptoms. And you see it here, right? So there is a statistical significance, and these are the main predictors for developing or for experiencing anxiety. Women more than men, again, even though men were more genuine with their response, women were more prone for reporting at least more anxiety symptoms. Age this time, but negatively so. So the same as before, younger more than older. Finding the newscast stressful and addictive, and having fear of missing out were all statistical predictors of reporting anxiety symptoms, right? So what the bottom line is, what I'm trying to say is that is what we wrote in the first paper we published, and that's that. Viewers were essentially captive audience. They had no way of getting out. They found the newscasts addictive. They wanted more. The news channels gave them more to meet the demand. They were even willing to relinquish their revenue through commercials break for the sake of meeting up with the demand. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of distress. In that regard, the discussion that was sparked before has some merits to it, right? But the ultimate bottom line is detrimental for people's well-being. So yes, there is an element of control. So you want to know what's happening because there is a survival benefit in knowing what's going on, right? So if you know the threat and you know the risk, you can avoid it, you can take action to save your lives. But if you're seeing it at home and you are thousands of kilometers away or hundreds of kilometers away from where things are happening and there's really no threat to you, the fact that you keep watching these newscasts again and again and over, day in, day out, most of the days, all over again and again and again, keep watching the same videos in loops, will create anxiety that will later on, depending on the extent of your anxiety, can translate into psychopathologies. And if nowadays anyone will measure the prevalence of PTSD and especially the consumption of prescribed psychological medicine, I'm betting my money on it, you'll see an increase there. And that can be traced back to this, can be traced back to the first few weeks where people were incapable of controlling their news consumption, meeting with news channels willing to increase their news reporting and the cycle that creates, right? And now my question to you, yeah, we can also talk about how it is in your country, but I also want to ask you the following question. So whose fault is this? Is it our fault as the public that we cannot, to what extent is it the responsibility of the news channels or the news reporters to break and put a stop to their news reporting? Or is it us as the public who needs to put a stop to our addictive behavior? Because if we think about it in any other way, such as smoking or drinking or gambling, the response of the government, let's say, is that I'll have some subsidies to help you deal with your addiction, but ultimately it's your problem. You're a big person, grown up, deal with it. I mean, you need to choose to work actively to mitigate your addiction, right? And yes, maybe I can subsidize some programs for you, or the public can subsidize some program for those suffering from the addiction. But that's it. That's the extent of it. It's your responsibility as a person to take care of your addiction. So is that also the case with news consumption? Is it our responsibility as a public, or should the regulator, let's say Ministry of Communication, says, you know what, this time I'm turning my attention to the news channels and I'm telling you, you should put a limit to the amount of hours you're reporting news. You are not allowed anymore to report news, but for 4 hours a day. Is that the solution? Yeah.
Even if it's regulated for 4 hours a day, there's still so many other ways to get that news.
Okay.
Multiple channels, and if everybody does 4 hours, you've got the 24 hours covered again.
Again, right.
And social media too. I mean, you're going to watch the same content, but you can't block people from that.
Okay, so let's move away from the technicality of things, but who should be in charge of, because we can all agree there's a market failure here, a public health market failure, right? If it was for smoking or drinking or obesity or whatever, the regulator would have been involved in doing something about it long ago, right? They're doing something about when it comes to public health aspects. This is the public health aspect. Well, psychological well-being is definitely a public health aspect. If people don't treat their distress and anxiety, they do develop eventually PTSD. If they have PTSD, they are less capable of working, they consume more medication, they have less quality of life, and they die sooner. So it's definitely a public health issue. Should the regulator now intervene? And if they intervene, who should they put their focus on? The public, saying, listen, you need to take care of your grown-up business and be less addicted to the newscast, or the news channel saying, you need to find a way to balance things out.
It's both, just like with things like smoking or alcohol too.
Mm-hmm.
They can't forbid it completely, but they have, in a sense, like they regulate for companies selling cigarettes, you're obliged to do packaging like that is not attractive,
Mm-hmm.
Do different things like that, and basically force, in this case, the media outlet would force them to also bring the public to awareness of what it can cause.
So almost like when you have on the cigarette packs, smoking can kill you. You should have a strip on the TV. Watching the videos can be detrimental for your psychological well-being.
Honestly, I mean, I've heard about this before, but I don't know many people who actually are aware of that
Mm-hmm.
in the general public.
Mm-hmm.
So even just that, forcing them to make the general public aware of it so that the general public has a chance to say, well, maybe it isn't good for them, like with smoking or something, that you inform the public so that they can decide whether it's good for them or not, would already, I would say, is the responsibility of the media outlet. And then you can also give responsibility to the public at the same time, because once they're informed, they can make informed decisions.
Okay.
For that,
Okay.
Public knows that it's bad. I think that, at least like from what I've seen after October 7th, like speaking to people who were consuming so much of it, like through social media, which was our primary way to see like the news and stuff, people were like, well, I have to get off because like it was ruining my mental health. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't do this. I was stressing out. But then I went back on because I was like, I needed to know more. And it's like, they were saying, they're like, it's like a few of them deleted their social media. Like, I think people were not very much aware, but I think they were aware to a certain extent that the amount of news that they were consuming and not
something wasn't healthy with the way. Yeah.
And it wasn't good, and they were aware that they were going back to watching it despite knowing that they shouldn't be watching.
So what you are suggesting is that you cannot ask the public to be more consumption aware.
It's just like it's like an instinct that you can't say no to.
So who is responsible to safeguard the well-being of people?
People actually putting it out.
So the media.
Yeah.
So you will restrict media reporting.
No.
You see the problem? You see the problem? Yeah, and I'll then come back to you.
I would actually do like regulate, of course, media's, especially the ones that have like a certain reach, like a big news channel, for them to adhere to certain standards of production of content. What that means, for example, so I don't think that you should censor, for example, all the videos and the graphic content, but maybe forbid them or like prevent them from playing it on a loop, covering 95% of the screen, you know, like have the speaker be more like 75% of the screen, you know, a smaller part of the picture is maybe just the video.
Okay.
Stuff like that. And then like actual limitations on, you know, the looping thing is a big thing. Like just stop that all around. You can show it once per hour, maybe the same clip or whatever, right?
So I don't want to discourage your idea because it sounds very logical. But my next question is, what will happen then? Where will people consume their news? Somewhere else.
Nothing.
Or else.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about it.
Okay, that's an hypothesis. You can test that. My gut feeling suggests, and I'm basing on what I'm seeing here as a sociological phenomena, is that people need this stimuli. They need it. Goes back to the discussion we had before.
But there's a difference between like you know, turning on the TV and then being exposed to the loops on repeat, or going to my phone and typing television.
Show me the video that it's true.
There's a bigger threshold. Like the threshold for
at least for some people, what you are suggesting, the self-regulation or the standards, will help a proportion of the population, which just happened to open the TV and now is exposed to something, not actively looking for gruesome images, right? So at least for that portion of the population, it will be beneficial. Okay, I promise these two, and then I'll come back to you. So this. Yes. Yes.
Like governmental authorities would say, like, you can impose like guidelines for fake news, blah blah blah. But so actually, I think censorship is kind of regulation.
Provide any meaningful change. Okay. Yes.
I keep thinking about this concept of all these news organizations being for profit instead of being nonprofit, and money plays a massive role in it. Algorithms push radical wording, like just generally, if something is a clickbait, you click on it for the money. Like they want that for the money, because we now live in a world where you're not getting a newspaper in the morning every day, and then you consume the news for an hour in the morning when you're drinking your coffee.
Right.
Now you're consuming it 24/7, and the news people, like the news companies, need the revenue from the
Yes.
So transforming news agencies from being for-profit businesses to then be nonprofit would be an interesting way to combat it, because then like the money is not.
But then it means they're government. They're governmental.
So there's no like winning in this, obviously, but the best thing would be to like revert back to the newspapers in the morning. But that's not gonna happen.
No.
But this whole like, you know, there is a massive like downgrade in quality of news as a result of it being 24/7, and like you need to get it out as quickly as possible so that you can get the best profits, so that you can be the one breaking the news in the morning, you know?
Right.
The money plays a massive role in everything. I don't know. It's like not telling them what to do, but it is because of being from the government. But like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah. Yes.
I'm thinking about all those random places that, in like for example, gym, like, like there.
Waiting for the doctor's appointment.
Yeah, exactly. Restaurant maybe,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just like always.
Maybe. Mm-hmm. Okay.
You cannot avoid it if you don't want to see it. Yeah, like you don't.
So if you are actively choosing to avoid it, it's not shoved down your throat, right? There are, but again.
I was just going to add, because I know in Germany, for example, underground stations, train stations, even in the train, there's screens that show the news. So if you're just riding the train and you don't want to know anything, you can't. You have to close your eyes because otherwise you see it.
All right. So maybe they're a good place to start. Yes.
That owns the news.
Yes.
Because even for social media, it's YouTube, so WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, all these platforms are owned by people. These are companies. So it can be like we can actually, the same way we have rules to enforce to the companies that this is what you should let people that are on your platforms post. You are, for example, with the whole discriminating content, there's usually something that comes before you, a warning. So maybe we can enforce more of that, and also before posting, there can be like a screening, and this is something that companies can do. It's not that hard, and WhatsApp, people can just post anything. There has to be a certain screening. So that means if you post what is screened, that means it's good for the public.
Right.
And people will just have no choice but to be changed.
Informed. They'll be more informed. Good point. Yes.
Just wanted to add that like censorship in like doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I'm saying that in Germany and Austria we have like this regulation that you cannot publish hateful content, especially anti-Semitism. And that is also like you could have regulation that says like publishing or distributing content that is like detrimental to mental health, which this obviously is, because it can lead to you can make the argument for that, and then and of course it has to be moderated, because then you have like the other side is like right to information, right to be to access information, all that, right? So there needs to be a dialogue between, right? So I don't think that censorship in this case is moderation would be maybe a better word.
Necessarily bad.
In the past, people would just go online and talk about whatever, and there was a lot of increase in bullying on social media and the internet.
Right.
But because of regulations, and I mean, it's a process. They can't just stop.
Definitely.
It has to start with their awareness, and people have to be informed, and rules have to come to place, and all these platforms also have to perform to those. So in 10 years from now, people actually know what to post and what to comment.
Right.
And I think even now, if you go on someone's post, and there's usually that says that your comment should only bring positivity, and if it's any hateful, even the phone itself, it doesn't post it. So I think with time, it can work.
Reconstructing socio-normative behavior. Was there another comment?
Yes, I wanted just to say something, because it's a bit strange, I know, but I stopped watching news after COVID. I stopped.
Okay.
So last year I was here in Israel, and my family was worried about me. They sent me message like, what happened? We watched the news. Actually, there is an attack. Said, I don't know nothing. I'm here. I help people. I'm here because I want to be here. And I don't want to feel like stress with anxiety, because I was very stressed. So during the COVID, I had a very strange experience because I lived in Geneva for a long time, and then I come from Italy. So in Italy, there was this big information about a lot of people dead, etc. And watching this news, because I was in another country, so this feeling of anxiety was deeper, because I was in another country, and in my country there was a very big issue, a big problem with people died, burned, because there were not places to bury people in the cemetery. Big issue.
Yes.
So I remember the difference, because in Italy people were watching TV 24 hours. In Switzerland it was very different. Government adopted a different strategy, probably. News, of course, information, but not with this obsession. So probably it's also, I think, I don't know, okay, cultural. I think a choice from the government, the culture, the country. And Switzerland is a nice place with the different cultures. They deal with a lot of different issues, different languages. So probably this approach was better than the Italian approach, because people in Italy were so anxious, okay?
Right.
So probably there is a factor, like cultural factor.
Definitely. Definitely there is a sociocultural factor there. Okay, thank you so much for the discussion. It was really intriguing, and I appreciate the participation. What I would suggest as the bottom line is the following thing. Unlike other unhealthy behaviors, such as smoking, drinking, gambling, which have, let's call it, non-real benefit for the person acting on these behaviors, or at least when you outweigh the benefits of the behavior against the risk that the behavior creates, watching news serves a very crucial benefit for people. That's survival. Okay? You don't smoke to survive. You don't drink to survive. You don't gamble to survive. You watch the news to understand the do's and don'ts to keep you alive, especially when there's a security threat and you don't know if there's terrorists outside. Can you go outside? What can you do, right? So under these circumstances, applying the same rules or the same kind of mechanisms for regulation makes little sense. And what I think should happen is that a convention should be set where the regulator, the media outlets, and the public sit down together and create the boundaries of what is acceptable and what is beyond acceptable, and where people who want and need more information, where they can get their information from, and for the rest of the people, how media coverage should look like. And that should be a consensus process. It shouldn't come as a dictating from the regulator. It shouldn't come from the media self-censoring themselves and deciding what is bad and good. And it also shouldn't be just the public saying what it is they want and don't want, because it's not, they don't necessarily know what it is they want and don't want. So only a joint venture of this sort, where you convene together and get a consensus about what is appropriate under these circumstances, could probably yield a more reasonable news reporting in the era of disasters and emergencies. And what I wanted to share with you in this presentation today was this sociological phenomenon that is very, very complex. The fact that people under circumstances of disasters and emergencies seem to be a captive audience, unable to regulate their news consumption. And under these circumstances, they create a huge demand for news, and the news outlet increase their news reporting to meet with that demand. And it's a self-perpetuating circle of distress that ultimately creates detrimental effects on people's well-being and public health in general. So that's the take-home message from today. And yeah, any other questions, comments for today? No. So thank you very much. See you next week.